Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about archaeology and the Patriarchs. Now, the Patriarchs is a period in Genesis that starts in chapter 12 and really goes to the end of the book, and it covers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. And the story of the Patriarchs that we're going to be talking about, though, really deals more with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their tenure in the ancient Near East with Mesopotamia and Canaan. And this is what we're going to be talking about, is that region. We'll be talking about Egypt in another video. But this region is replete with a lot of archaeological evidence that would support the veracity of the story that is told in Genesis, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. As mentioned, the key biblical texts for this study are from Genesis chapter 12 through 50, and some of the key figures are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, and Hagar, and there are other characters obviously in this story, but we're mainly going to be focused on the family of Abraham. Some key locations for this would be Ur, Haran, and Canaan, and this really covers a rather large geographic region spanning from the Persian Gulf all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea, and the time frame would be about 2000 BC. It's really difficult to date when the Patriarchs lived, but most people would put it around this time frame, so this is going to be the working date that we're going to be using for our study here to look at the archaeological evidence for it, and then really show you why this is probably one of the best dates to use, because the archaeological evidence really does fit well with this time frame and what is unveiled in the scriptures. There are some challenges in archaeology as it relates to this time frame, and I do want to mention a few of these. One of the reasons that archaeology is challenging from this time period is because writing was not common. It was actually a relatively new invention. In Mesopotamia, much of the writing was put down on clay tablets, and the clay tablets were bulky and fragile, so it wasn't something that you could just load up and take with you. Most of the tablets that have been discovered have been found in urban areas, and those urban areas were usually dealing with things like court records or things that scribes would have recorded whenever they're counting things and things like that. And they do have some tablets that describe the cultural nuances and laws and some of the myths that were available to them in those times and spaces. So but they weren't common among other people such as Abraham. And the reason why they wouldn't be common among people like Abraham is because Abraham was semi-nomadic. So if you can think about clay tablets, they wouldn't be something that you could easily carry along with you. You would need something else to carry with you if you were going to be a semi-nomadic person moving from place to place, and clay tablets just wouldn't be very conducive for that. So it would be unrealistic to expect somebody like Abraham to have any mention of him in a writing that was possessed by some semi-nomadic people. If he did interact with people in cities, they might have recorded his name, but to date, there's never been a discovery of Abraham specifically mentioned in some of these ancient texts. Third, archaeology from this time is also very sparse compared to other time frames where archaeological discoveries are much more abundant. From this time frame, it's actually pretty sparse, and that's one, it's very old time. Much of the archaeological evidence from this has been destroyed because the sites where they were discovered have been destroyed and rebuilt over the ages. So what is left is scant remains of what used to be there, and also the period at this time was a period in human history where populations weren't real large, so not a lot of artifacts were created for that matter, and given the fact that many people were still nomadic in nature, it follows that the kinds of archaeological sites that we do have, like urban centers, would not be in great numbers like they are in later periods in history. And fourth, without affirmation of Abraham in some kind of writing, it's hard to peg a date, so dating the patriarchs becomes tough. So most of what is done in terms of archaeology is based on inferences from what has been discovered and what is recorded in the Bible, and trying to understand how the story of the Patriarchs best fits into history, and that's why they've chosen the dates that they have around 2000 BC based on data in the Bible and based on some of the cultural practices that are found in the Bible. And with those cultural practices, they're able to look at the cultural practices from the ancient Near East and surmise a best case scenario for Abraham and why he would fit into that particular time frame. The story of Abraham starts in Ur, which was a fairly major city in Babylon, and Abraham and his family take a journey up to Haran, and Haran would become an important location in the narrative that is given in Genesis, because this is where Abraham goes from down to Canaan, but he sends his servant back to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, and that's where Rebekah comes from. And then after Esau and Jacob are born, Jacob goes back to Haran to live for a period of several years where he's working for his uncle Laban, and then he marries Rachel and Leah, and that's where his family is started. Ultimately, Jacob then moves back down to Canaan, and then towards the end of his life, because of the famine in Canaan, he moves on to Egypt. Now that we have a general idea of the journey that Abraham took from Ur to Haran and then down to Canaan and then ultimately Jacob down to Egypt, we can look at some of the archaeological data that shows the history and the culture from this time and space. One of the most significant finds comes from the city of Mari. Now, Mari was an ancient town that had a number of tablets that described laws and cultural practices from that time. It had covenants that were sealed with the sacrifice of an animal, adoption, owning slaves, and inheritance practices like those found in Genesis. Also, these tablets mention a number of gods that are also mentioned in the Bible. Another set of tablets that was found in Mesopotamia mentions the practice of giving gifts for brides, similar to the story that was found in Genesis 24, where Abraham sends his servant back to Haran to find a wife for Rebekah, and he gives expensive gifts to Rebekah's father in exchange for her to come back to Abraham so she can marry Isaac, who is Abraham's son. More tablets were found at another site called Ugarit, and Ugarit has been the source of a lot of information about ancient Canaanite religions, but this particular town gives vast knowledge about the culture in Canaan, and it also mentions a lot of interactions with semi-nomadic people like Abraham who would buy land and trade and often fight with or against the Ugarites. And we can find similar narratives like this in the Bible where Abraham rescues his nephew Lot, or where he engages in the transaction of buying land from the Hittites in order to buy a place to bury his wife and ultimately a place for him to be buried. So these kind of exchanges that are documented in the Ugaritic text also map onto some of the content that we have in Genesis as well. Another set of documents that have been found in Mesopotamia come from the town of Nuzi, and the Nuzi texts are another set of documents that describe some practices, and one of the ones that is significant here is the idea of a surrogate mother for an heir, and this practice is described in the Nuzi text, and it's very similar to the story of Hagar that is found in Genesis 16. Another significant find that really relates to this time and space comes from Egypt. And down in Egypt, they found the excretion text, which was a set of texts that mentions a number of places that are mentioned in the Bible, including the city of Aphek and Eker and Laish, which is the biblical city of Dan, and then Ashkelon. Now, these cities are mentioned later in the Bible, but these texts date to the time of Abraham. So the significance here is that these texts really show that these cities did exist before Israel did conquer the land of Israel, but they are historical in the sense that the Bible mentions them at a later time and place. So they did exist before the Judges period, which we'll cover in a later video, but we are mentioning them here because they are significant to the time and place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now we've looked at some of the text from this time and space. We can look at some of the locations that we've mentioned already. One of the most significant would be Ur, and Ur was the place of Abraham's birth, and later he moved out with his family to Haran. Ur was one of the major metropolises in ancient Babylonia, or what we would call Sumer at the time, and it was a very powerful city. It was really the seat of a city-state, or maybe even an empire, and it had a major ziggurat there, and around that ziggurat would have been a urban center that developed where a lot of people would come in for trade, and it was seated down near the junction of the Euphrates and Tigris River, near the mouth of these two rivers' confluence into the Persian Gulf. And that means it was a very significant city in terms of trade, and it was also a very powerful city in that particular region as well. So you can imagine that Abraham was coming from a fairly cosmopolitan city for his time and space. In this city, the religion of the people was paramount to their government as well as their daily lives, and they had a whole pantheon of gods, and the city was more or less ruled by priest kings. So it was almost a theocracy, if you will, where the ultimate authority rested more in the religious authorities, and the common people were really in submission to those in authority. It was almost, I wouldn't call it a dictatorship because that would be an overstatement, but it was very much a oligarchy and serfdom underneath that oligarchy that was really influential on the day-to-day lives of the individual. Now, Abraham, being from a family of means, was probably from that upper echelon of people, because we do know that he came from a wealthy family. But why he left is somewhat of a mystery with his family. God did call him from Haran to go to Canaan, but he left with his father and went up to Haran. Maybe it was to live closer to family up there. Maybe it was because some political turmoil in Ur. It's really not known, but he did move away from this urban area up to Haran. And that would have been the cultural background for Abraham whenever he was growing up, was this cosmopolitan area that was had a lot of influence and wealth and power in the region. One of the major finds in Ur relates to the religion of the people. They found a number of sacrificial burial pits, and these pits were filled with human remains that were put in the pits in an organized fashion. It wasn't an ad hoc burial, and these pits showed the devotion that the people had to their priest kings and their God. And the idea here is that this sheds a lot of light on the cultural practices that Abraham was raised up in. So when Abraham goes to sacrifice his son Isaac as a demonstration of his faith in Genesis chapter 22, it shows that he did it as a way of showing his fervor for his God, and that would have been his upbringing to do that. But in the story, when Abraham goes to sacrifice his son, he is about to do it, and God commands him not to do it. Instead, he is stopped from killing Isaac, and instead a ram is provided as a substitute, and God commands Abraham to sacrifice that, and he does. The practice of human sacrifice at this point in Abraham's mind was still acceptable because that was his upbringing, and there's no evidence that it was ever revealed to him that he shouldn't do that. But later on in the Bible, we do find that God says don't do human sacrifice, particularly child sacrifice, and that the sacrifice of human is something that the Mosaic law condemns. But understanding where Abraham comes from and the cultural background that he was raised in does give us a little bit of hint as to why he might not have even questioned God in the practice of sacrificing his sons. He even surmises that God could raise Isaac from the dead, but he does so without wavering, and he does so to show his devotion to God. And that's a fairly interesting way to look at this thing in light of where he was raised and what archaeology has revealed in light of the scriptures. The last place I want to look at is the place that Abraham migrated to, which is Haran. Now, Haran was a merchant's outpost, and it was frequented by semi-nomadic people like Abraham. And why Abraham moved from the metropolis of Ur to what was more or less a backwater up at the mouth of some of the source waters for the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is an unknown. But this place was, like I said, a backwater backwater compared to the place that Abraham had come from. But nevertheless, it becomes a very important location in the Bible, and it was the place where, like I mentioned, Jacob went to work for his uncle Laban, and where Isaac's wife came from as well. And it's also where Abraham left to go down to Canaan. And this location doesn't have a lot of significance outside of the biblical record, really. It's just a significant location in the biblical record because this is where Abraham's family was from. So it's not nearly as a significant city as, say, like Mari or Assur or even Nineveh or Babylon or many other cities. But it is worth mentioning here that the city is located, and they have found archaeological remains there that do speak to the fact that it was a trading outpost for semi-nomadic people like Abraham. So it makes sense that Abraham might visit a place like this, or nomadic families would come and settle in a place like this to do trade with other people like them in that part of the world at that time. Now that we've done a little survey of some of the archaeology related to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what are some of the takeaways that we could say about this? Well, I think there's a few things we can say. One is that archaeology corroborates the culture of Abraham. Now, the culture that is given in Genesis speaks to a number of things, like the kinds of practices they have concerning slaves and surrogate wives, and bride prices, buying land and trading, giving homage to kings, going to battle, and several other events that we do have in Genesis that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob take part in. And these kind of cultural references are found in the archaeological record from that time and space, so it corroborates the story of Abraham from that perspective. Second, the places that are mentioned in the Bible are historical. We see the places that Abraham came from and he went to, and several of the cities that he visited along the way are indeed historical places. And they are mentioned not only in Mesopotamian texts, but they are mentioned also in Egyptian texts, which is much further away. So we can say that the places that are in the Bible are not fiction, but they are indeed historical places. And third, the kinds of events that are recorded in archaeology corroborates the events in the Bible. So what I'm talking about here is the kinds of events that happen in the text, where you have migrations, where you have wars, where you have buying and selling of land, where you have trade, where you have people moving from place to place, and a number of things like that that are described in Genesis map onto the kinds of events that are found in the archaeological record as well. So these kind of three things combined really put the story of Abraham on firm footing historically, so we can affirm the historicity of the story. Now, as I mentioned, it would be an overstatement to saying that archaeology actually directly confirms Abraham, because at this point there's never been a discovery that mentions Abraham by name or any of his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is. And because of that, it's, again, not something that archaeology has directly confirmed, but it does corroborate the story and make it sound very historical from what is described in the books of the chapters in Genesis 12 through 50. And because of that, I think we can say that it is historical, and it has historical value for that matter. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and then clicking on the bell icon to receive notifications when new content becomes available. You can also follow us on Twitter @AbideDevo. And as always, thank you for watching.